it occurred to us today on the Bolton question. You can pre-order his testimony. We went on Amazon, and the hardcover, I think, is $29.25. Yes, there it is. Publication date, it's out March 17th. A lot of the story is going to be right in that book. So what will a Cory Gardner have to say to the people of a state like, Colorado, when we're able to thumb through that and see what the potential testimony could have been?
What he will say to the people of Colorado is Trump, 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 Trump. Because that's literally his.
I didn't get your meaning.
Yes, exactly. It's a form of Pig Latin that they use in Colorado. So that's his only way of operating. He has said that Donald Trump is going to be my protective shield. And despite the fact that you have not just Bolton, but there are other people who are corroborating this. He spoke to the head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House and said, hey, you should investigate this. More and more people are coming through and adding evidence and adding information to what Donald Trump is being impeached about. And the senators who have decided, whether it's McSally, whether it's Collins, anyone who is a part of this cover-up and conspiracy is going to have to answer to the public. But I want to put this out there because this goes to what we mentioned earlier. If the president does something in his own interest, it basically is fine, right? If he sees, take a plot from House of Cards. If Trump decides 2 weeks before the election to talk to DeSantis in Florida and talk to Republican governor of Ohio and say, you know what, let's just shut down voting booths. I think the coronavirus might get people. It's for the public interest. We just shouldn't have people voting in all these locations. It's dangerous. What do we do then? This is literally what they're talking about. If you don't stop this president from cheating now, he will cheat again. And that's what I think is so disturbing about the Cory Gardners and the Collins and everybody else in the Senate who sees a man who clearly says, I will cheat again, and they do nothing about it.
And you know what's sad about that? Folks in my party would go, oh, he would never do that. That's just liberal hogwash. You're just making that scenario up.
That's the old moving bar of he would never do that.
But I think the most important thing that came out of today's conversation or Q&A was the fact that White House counsel, in their official capacity as White House counsel, and certainly as counsel for the president, looked the country in the eye and said that any candidate can now go to a foreign government and say, if you've got dirt on my opponent, let me have it, because, like in the president's words, well, I think I want to know that. That's good information. So all you senators out there, get ready. You just opened up a Pandora's box of hell, because coming up in your next, probably this fall, a number of you are going to be up in campaigns, and where that information comes from, we don't want to hear you complaining. We don't want to hear you moaning and groaning. Just suck it up and suck it down, because you're going to live with what you're doing tonight. Because that's the heart of this thing.
Andrew.
So it's a little inside baseball. Someone who is former DOJ, the fact that it was White House counsel is really interesting, because this issue that the personal is the political and the political is the personal, that the president is the state, is embodied in the presidential team that's arguing this. It is one thing to have Dershowitz and private counsel make these arguments, because that's what they do. That's what private counsel is supposed to do. It is shocking, as somebody who has been in the Department of Justice for years, to see people who are paid by the public. These are public officers arguing not just on behalf of the White House in the White House's interest. That would be fine. But to be making arguments that are so flatly contradicted by the law that no responsible public servant would be making that. And that's because there is absolutely no daylight between White House counsel and private counsel, which is a wall that when Don McGahn was there, you saw it there. But that's completely gone.
From the very beginning of this.
And Dahlia, for those who enjoy citing stare decisis, law can last a long time. Arguments that form predicates can last a good long time and leave a mark.
I think, to me, the staggering shift that I saw today, that I'm still trying to sort of take in, is, with all due respect to the senators, we didn't talk about John Bolton today. Today we stopped talking about John Bolton because the response from the president's lawyers was, we don't need to hear what he has to say, because whatever he has to say, whatever the president did, was legal. That's what changed today. Quid pro quo is legal. Doing whatever you want in your own interest is legal. Conflating the interests of you as a candidate and the country is legal. All of that is okay. And I think and it goes to Andrew's point, the minute you've just accepted that all of that is the same thing, we don't need to hear from John Bolton, they're saying, because he's just going to confirm something that we all agree, even if it happened, it's completely permissible. Holy cow, that as a precedent going forward, that is bone chilling.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.